Over the past year, I've been making videos for the first time, and while it was a bit nerve-wracking at first, I've become increasingly excited to have the opportunity to present my philosophies about astrology and metaphysics using what is, for me, a new platform. I'm discovering that videos can communicate my ideas in a new way. Not only do people see me physically, obviously, but I can add images and words that allow me to play with new methods of presenting this kind of information, which can be quite complicated at times. This video is different, though, because I want to describe how I approach an astrological consultation. I'm aware that traditionally one gets what's called a reading from an astrologer. But to me, a reading implies varying degrees of monologuing. In the beginning of my practice, I admit to doing just that. Like most astrologers, I would what's called delineate the person's chart. I would describe the key general features and then break down the sun, moon, and planets by sign and house, and ask the person to record the session and play it back, perhaps, during the following months in order for them to get whatever they missed the first time. The truth was that I was uncomfortable with this method, and over the years became increasingly so. I think the reason for this is that I was a therapist before becoming an astrologer, and was trained not to simply tell people who they were from a test, or what they should do about a particular problem or life situation that they were facing at that particular time. Just because I became an astrologer didn't mean I had to drop the way I counsel people, especially if, to me, it proved to be ineffective. Describing or delineating a chart can defeat the counseling process itself. The main reason for this is that just giving people information or trying to predict their future is not nearly as important as helping them make new discoveries. While I still do readings on occasions, if asked, most people do not prefer this approach once they've heard about the alternative. Describing the nature of that alternative is what this video is all about. The way I learned astrology was twofold. I read as many books as I could get my hands on, and then compared the data that I gathered from the books with the direct experience I was having with the clients I was seeing and their own unique horoscopes. My purpose was not to stereotype or limit my understanding of them in any way. It was to have some kind of framework that would both help me understand them better and also suggest ways I could communicate with them in a constructive and helpful manner. I regarded the chart as a map of potentials, not as a description of who they were or had to be. I quickly understood that many astrologers were not approaching this field in the way I was. There was a tendency of some of them to pigeonhole, and worse yet, to give concrete advice to clients about what will or will not happen, or what they should or shouldn't do. For example, one person told me of an astrologer who told her that she could die in an airplane crash, so she refused to fly for over 20 years. To me, this is not only invalid astrology, but is inhumane and cruel. It ruins all of the wonderful potentials that the field of astrology can offer us. The fact is that astrology is very complex. Even if a qualified astrologer were to set out to describe a person's natal chart, it would take many hours just to crack the surface of that chart. And for what? What would a person take away from hours and hours of one-way information? Might it be overwhelming? Of course. Could it even have contradictory information that creates confusion? Yes, of course. Further, this is not even the biggest issue. Let's take a step back and look at an obvious idea to consider. By definition, an astrologer looks at every chart and sees that each one of us is incredibly unique. This realization must therefore also include the astrologer's own chart as well. Pretty obvious if you think about it. What this means is that astrology is not and cannot ever be objective. It is a symbolic system that requires interpretation by a person who has their own chart with their own perspectives both personally and astrologically. No astrologer is the same as any other. Thus, no reading can ever be the same as any other as well. It is a totally subjective field, and we need to understand that. But just because this is true does not mean astrology can't be valuable. It does, however, force us to ask the following question. How can it be used so that it's helpful and constructive given its subjectivity? And how can it be personalized so that relevant and helpful information can be given in a very short amount of time? It is my view that a session needs to begin with the recognition that an astrologer will need to develop an understanding of the client before much can be said. The chart itself is not standing on its own as if it were independent of the person sitting across from the astrologer. The symbols must be interpreted and applied in a specific context and in a way that enables the client to understand and connect with the ideas being presented. The context must be provided by the client, but the astrologer, like a therapist, can help the client develop this framework of understanding so that the astrologer gains the needed knowledge to know what specific information needs to be given to the person for that particular session. While it is true that people often come to an astrologer for specific issues and advice, there's a broader purpose that the astrologer would do well to understand, and when possible, apply. I will describe 4 basic principles I always keep in mind, although there are, of course, more than just these. Number 1, to help the client become more self-aware. It's very interesting to see a person's response when I suggest something fundamental in their natal chart that they do, on one hand, immediately understand and relate to as true about themselves, but have not yet recognized. They've not seen it before. When this happens, the person often feels validated and empowered, and yet they only have actually begun to know themselves a bit better. This process is not to be trivialized. I've seen many times that it can help a person out of anxiety or depression. It can be that significant. So often we are trained by life to believe that we're not quite right or normal, so we feel we must change ourselves. This then, of course, leads to frustration and self-invalidation because our basic nature is set in this life, and we end up feeling awful about ourselves. Astrology can help us see what our basic tendencies are and enable us to accept these and even use them to our advantage. This can change our outlook on ourselves and on life enormously. The second focus is the integration of internal conflicts. No person is free from internal conflicts. This is just the nature of life. But astrology is one field that can show us what many of these are and go further to suggest how we might learn to deal with them and even integrate them. We deal with them initially by being more aware of them as conflicts, and then we might begin to ask how we can integrate these conflicts and confusions into our psyche so they are no longer conflicting. Carl Jung, the famous psychotherapist, labeled this process the process of individuation. Another way of understanding it is to move towards becoming whole, or as he put it, making the unconscious conscious. This may be a new idea for some of us, but Jung himself used astrology as part of this transformational process. It's one of the most hidden potential uses of astrology. The third factor is elevating one's consciousness. There is a famous Einstein quote that suggests that we cannot solve a problem with the same level of thinking that created it. I know we often think that astrology can answer life's questions about relationships, money, career, etc. And it can help us with these and much more, but perhaps not in the way we usually think. Yes, astrology can provide some insights into these questions, but it can do much more. Most people who come to me for a consultation are in the midst of some kind of life crisis. After all, Why would someone go to an astrologer when everything is working fine and dandy? The answer that they're looking for may at first be simply a concrete answer about what they should do about a given situation. But actually, will that be sufficient? Or are there bigger questions at play in the person's life than what one should do about a particular problem? Might the situation they find themselves in actually be a call for them to look at their life in a fundamentally different way? Might it be an opportunity to ask questions that one has avoided asking in the past? This is more likely to be what they actually need. When one elevates one's consciousness, one will be able to make higher quality decisions, the type that increases one's quality of life and their joy and happiness. It will reduce the chaos, confusion, and disorder in one's life as well. This is the kind of process working with an astrologer trained in this method can bring about. Number 4, astrology reveals the existence of an order, a pattern, and harmony to the universe, which in turn demonstrates that same harmony existing within each of us. While science does this as well, its approach is quite impersonal, whereas astrology's approach profoundly connects the impersonal with the deeply personal. It brings them together into one holistic system. This can ennoble us in a way that is difficult to describe, and yet it can leave a person in a state of awe and even inner silence. It gives us a sense of meaning and purpose that helps us feel that each of us is a part of existence. Thus, the quote from Terence McKenna can inspire us when he said, "You are a divine being. You matter. You count." I begin a consultation by getting to know the person and finding out what they would like for me to look at and go into. I may ask clarifying questions to help me hone in on what the person is seeking to know more about or understand. This often takes some time, but it's time well spent. Then I try to express at least 2 to 3 basic principles that connect the person's chart with what they are asking about. I do not overwhelm a person with data for its own sake. The information needs to be relevant to what the person needs to know more about in the present moment. It must apply to them in a clearly personal way. This is how I avoid overwhelming the person. Also, this is how I avoid suggesting confusing or contradictory data as well. All the information I give is in context with their present life and their needs at the present time. Let's go a little deeper. For some people who want to use astrology as an aid for personal growth and get more understanding, I do ongoing counseling from an astrological perspective on occasions. My background as a therapist combines with 40 years of study and practice of astrology so that they have become one seamless system for me. Let me add that my understanding of the power and usefulness of astrology is one of the main reasons why I focus so much on teaching this ancient metaphysical field. I don't just teach the subject in an impersonal way, but use the teaching of astrology as an opportunity to help people begin to explore their own unique spiritual path. This is because astrology can become a transformational path if it's learned in a way where its dynamic principles can be applied to both one's deepest concerns right alongside one's everyday livingness. This is how one's life can become more alive, more joyous, and magical.